It started on a quiet suburban street, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and sometimes, your business. The houses were neatly lined up, each one a mirror of the other with trimmed lawns, white fences, and flower beds that hinted at the homeowner's pride. Birds chirped, children played, and the occasional bark of a dog added to the calm rhythm of the neighborhood. It was the kind of place where nothing big ever seemed to happen. But that day was different. Maya Brown, just 17, walked home from school like she always did, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her curly hair bounced with each step, and she had her headphones in, humming to her favorite song. It was her daily ritual, a moment to unwind after a long day of classes and tests. She loved walking through the neighborhood, feeling the sun on her face and the breeze tugging gently at her jacket. But Maya didn't know her life was about to change forever. From across the street, a man sat in a parked patrol car. He was watching her. His sharp eyes followed her every move, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. To anyone else, he might have seemed like just another officer on duty, but there was something unsettling about the way he watched her. He wasn't just doing his job, he was sizing her up. Maya didn't notice him at first. She was lost in her music, tapping her fingers against her thigh in time with the beat. She didn't think twice about the patrol car. It was normal to see officers in the area, especially after a recent string of burglaries. But as she walked closer, she started to feel uneasy. There was a strange heaviness in the air, as if the world had paused, holding its breath. The officer's name was Officer Blake. He had been on the force for years, and most people in the neighborhood knew him by name. But those who had encountered him up close often had stories of sharp words, unnecessary questions, and a cold, judgmental stare. He prided himself on being thorough, but some called it something else entirely: prejudice disguised as duty. Blake's eyes narrowed as Maya came into view. To him, she didn't look like she belonged. Her confidence, her headphones, even the way she walked, it all seemed to irritate him. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, hoping to spot something suspicious, and now he had decided that Maya was worth his attention. Maya crossed the street at the crosswalk, her steps steady. She was only a few blocks from home now, thinking about what her mom might be cooking for dinner and whether she should start her homework or relax with a book first. She didn't realize that Blake had turned his car on and was pulling up slowly behind her. A faint sound made her glance over her shoulder. She saw the patrol car creeping along the curb. Her stomach tightened, but she tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just patrolling the area, she thought. There had been those burglaries, after all. But her instinct whispered something else. Blake rolled down his window. "Hey, you there," he called out, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Maya paused and pulled out one earbud, her heartbeat quickening. "Yes," she replied, trying to sound calm. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. Maya frowned, confused. "I'm just walking home from school." Blake's eyes flicked to her backpack and then back to her face. "Home, huh? Where's that?" "Just a couple of blocks away," she said, pointing in the direction of her house. Her voice was polite, but there was a slight edge to it now. Why was he questioning her? She hadn't done anything wrong. Blake stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the pavement. He was a tall man with a hard expression, the kind that made people feel small under his gaze. "Mind if I ask what's in the bag?" he said, motioning to her backpack. Maya's heart raced. She clutched the straps of her bag tighter. "Just my books and stuff from school," she said, her voice steady but wary. "Let me see," Blake said, taking a step closer. Maya froze. She looked around, hoping someone might be nearby to witness this. A few houses had their curtains drawn back, but no one seemed to be paying attention. She felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Why do you need to see my bag? I didn't do anything. Blake's eyes narrowed. Don't make this difficult, he said. Just hand it over. Maya hesitated. She wasn't sure what to do. She had seen videos online of situations like this, and they rarely ended well. But she also knew she had done nothing wrong. Her instincts told her to stand her ground, but her fear urged her to comply. Sir, I'm just trying to get home, she said, her voice firmer now. I haven't done anything wrong. Blake's expression hardened. He took another step toward her, his hand resting on the belt where his handcuffs were clipped. Are you refusing to cooperate? He asked, his voice cold and threatening. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel her legs shaking, but she held her ground. I'm not refusing anything, she said, her voice trembling despite her best effort. I just don't understand why you're stopping me. The tension in the air was thick now. Blake's posture grew stiffer, and Maya felt like a rabbit cornered by a predator. She glanced around again, hoping someone would step in. Across the street, a man in a black SUV had been watching the scene unfold. He leaned forward, his face partially obscured by sunglasses. He had seen enough. Reaching for the door handle, he stepped out, his large frame commanding attention as he walked toward them. Maya didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on Blake, who seemed more determined than ever to assert his authority. But as the man approached, his deep voice cut through the tension. Excuse me, he said, his tone calm but firm. Is there a problem here? Maya turned to see him, a towering figure with a familiar face. It was Dwayne Johnson. And just like that, the quiet suburban street was no longer ordinary. It was the stage for a moment that would soon capture the world's attention. Maya blinked, startled by the man's sudden appearance. She didn't immediately recognize him, but there was something about his presence steady, assured, almost larger than life that made her feel a glimmer of hope. She stole a glance at Officer Blake, whose eyes narrowed as he sized up the newcomer. This doesn't concern you, Blake said, his voice clipped. Move along. Dwayne Johnson didn't flinch. Instead, he crossed his arms over his broad chest, his stance as unyielding as a stone wall. I think it does, he replied, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made people stop and listen. Blake's hand moved closer to the radio on his shoulder. Sir, I'm conducting an investigation. Step back, or I'll have to. An investigation. Dwayne interrupted, his eyebrows lifting. Into what, exactly? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're harassing a kid walking home from school. Maya felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to speak up, to say something in her defense, but the fear in her chest was too heavy. Still, the man's presence gave her a sense of protection she hadn't felt moments before. Blake took a step closer to Dwayne, his expression hardening. Listen, I don't need to explain myself to you. This is police business. Funny, Dwayne said, his tone still even. I didn't see anything that looked like police business when I walked over here. What I see is a young girl being cornered and intimidated for no reason. So, I'll ask again, what's the problem? Blake opened his mouth to respond but stopped short as more neighbors began peeking out of their windows, curious about the commotion. A few even stepped outside, their phones held discreetly at their sides. The growing audience made Blake's posture stiffen. Maya's voice finally found its way out. I just want to go home, she said softly, her eyes darting between Blake and Dwayne. I didn't do anything wrong. Dwayne glanced at her, his expression softening for a moment. I know, he said gently, then turned back to Blake. So, why don't you let her do that? Blake's jaw tightened. He looked at Maya again, then at Dwayne. She fits the description of someone we're looking for, he said finally. Dwayne raised an eyebrow. Really? And what description is that? Blake hesitated, and the silence hung heavy in the air. The tension between the two men was palpable now, like a rope being pulled taut. Dwayne took a step closer, lowering his voice but making sure everyone could still hear him. "See, the thing about descriptions," he said, "is they're usually pretty specific. So, unless you've got something real to go on, I'd say this girl is free to go." The crowd was growing, murmurs rippling through it like waves. Maya could feel their eyes on her, their presence giving her strength. She straightened her shoulders, no longer feeling quite so small. Blake looked around, realizing that the situation was slipping out of his control. He reached for his radio but didn't speak into it. His gaze darted back to Dwayne, who stood his ground, unflinching. "You don't know who you're messing with," Blake said under his breath, his voice low enough that only Dwayne could hear. Dwayne tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And you don't know who you're messing with," he replied, his voice steady and confident. The tension broke for a moment as someone in the crowd let out a soft laugh, quickly stifled. Blake's face turned red, and he took a step back, clearly weighing his options. Maya took a deep breath. "Am I free to go?" she asked, her voice louder now, carrying a note of determination. Blake hesitated, his eyes flicking between her and Dwayne. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he stepped aside. "Fine," he muttered. "But don't think this is over." Maya didn't move at first, unsure if it was really safe. Dwayne nodded at her, his expression reassuring. "Go on," he said. "You're good." She started walking, her legs trembling slightly but gaining strength with each step. The crowd parted to let her through, their murmurs turning to words of encouragement. Good for her. About time someone stood up to him. That guy's a hero. Dwayne stayed behind, his eyes fixed on Blake until Maya was safely out of sight. Then, he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, firm tone. "Next time, think twice before you try to intimidate someone who's done nothing wrong." Blake didn't respond. He simply climbed back into his car, slamming the door shut. The crowd began to disperse, but the buzz of what had just happened lingered in the air like static electricity. As Dwayne turned to leave, someone from the crowd called out, "Hey, aren't you?" He smiled faintly but didn't answer, waving them off as he headed back to his SUV. This wasn't about him, and he wasn't looking for recognition. He had done what he came to do. As Maya approached the crosswalk, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet street. Her footsteps slowed when she noticed a patrol car parked at the corner. Its engine hummed softly, and though the flashing lights were off, the presence of the vehicle made her uneasy. Through the windshield, she saw the officer sitting inside, a man with a stern face, cold eyes, and a permanent scowl etched into his features. His fingers drummed rhythmically on the steering wheel, but his gaze was fixed on her like a hawk spotting prey. Maya hesitated, feeling the weight of his stare. Her grip tightened on her backpack straps as her heart started to race. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this kind of scrutiny. Living as a black teenager in a predominantly white neighborhood had taught her to sense tension in the air, to pick up on the small, unspoken signs of hostility. She thought about crossing the street further down, but the patrol car blocked her only direct path. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself she had nothing to fear. "You're just walking home," she told herself. "You're doing nothing wrong." But as she stepped onto the crosswalk, the officer suddenly opened his car door. The sound made her flinch. He got out slowly, adjusting his belt as he stood tall. His presence loomed over the street, casting a shadow that seemed larger than it should have been. "You lost," he barked, his voice sharp and confrontational. Maya stopped in her tracks, startled by his tone. She shook her head quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, sir," she replied. "Just heading home." The officer's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer. Home, huh? Where's that? Maya hesitated. She felt the familiar knot tightening in her stomach. Just a couple of blocks that way, she said, motioning down the street. He didn't seem satisfied with her answer. His gaze scanned her up and down, as if searching for something to justify his growing suspicion. His hand rested on his belt, fingers brushing against the holstered weapon as a silent reminder of his authority. "What's in the bag?" he asked, nodding toward her backpack. Maya blinked, her confusion evident. "Just my school stuff," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Books, papers, that's all." The officer's scowl deepened. "Mind if I take a look?" Her heart skipped a beat. "Why?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer took another step closer, his towering frame making her feel small and trapped. "Don't get smart with me, girl. Just hand it over." Maya looked around, hoping someone nearby might see what was happening. The houses were quiet, curtains drawn, and the street was empty except for a few parked cars. The silence pressed in on her, amplifying her fear. "I'm just walking home," she said again, her voice quieter this time. "I don't understand what this is about." The officer's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. "You don't need to understand," he said. "You just need to do what you're told." Maya's mind raced. She had seen videos and read stories about situations like this, people being stopped, questioned, harassed, for no reason other than how they looked. Her instincts screamed at her to comply, to avoid escalating the situation. But a small, defiant voice inside her pushed back. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. The officer's eyes darkened. His hand moved to the radio clipped to his shoulder, and he pressed the button. "Need a unit at my location," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Possible suspect acting uncooperative." Maya's breath caught in her throat. Suspect. The word hit her like a slap. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Suspect of what?" she asked, her voice rising. "I didn't do anything." The officer didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward, reaching out as if to grab her backpack. Maya instinctively stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Don't move," he snapped, his voice like a whip. Maya froze, her legs trembling. She could feel tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. "You need to calm down, young lady," the officer said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Making this harder for yourself isn't going to help." Maya clenched her fists, the frustration boiling inside her. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said through gritted teeth. "I'm just trying to get home." The officer shook his head slowly, as if disappointed. "You people," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. Those two words cut through her like a blade. Her stomach churned, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to blur. She knew exactly what he meant, and the realization hit her with crushing weight. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling with anger now. He didn't respond, but his smirk said everything. Just then, a car pulled up to the curb. Maya turned her head, her heart leaping with a mix of relief and apprehension. The door opened, and a tall man stepped out. His silhouette was imposing against the late afternoon light. The officer glanced over, his expression shifting slightly as he registered the newcomer. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone impatient. The man walked closer, his movements calm and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was deep and steady. "I think the better question is, can I help her?" Maya looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized him now, the broad shoulders, the unmistakable charisma. It was Dwayne Johnson. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The officer squared his shoulders, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "This doesn't concern you," he said, his tone dismissive. Dwayne's gaze didn't waver. "It does now," he said firmly. Maya felt a surge of relief mixed with disbelief. She didn't know how or why he was here, but in that moment, she was grateful. The officer narrowed his eyes, clearly weighing his options. But Dwayne didn't give him time to respond. He stepped closer to Maya, positioning himself slightly in front of her like a shield. "You okay?" he asked her, his voice softer now. Maya nodded quickly, though her hands were still trembling. I think so." Dwayne turned his attention back to the officer. "What's the problem here?" The officer's jaw tightened. "This is official police business," he said. "Move along." Dwayne raised an eyebrow. "Official police business," he repeated. "Looks to me like you're harassing a kid walking home." The officer's face reddened, but he didn't back down. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he snapped. Dwayne took a step closer, his towering frame making the officer look smaller than he actually was. "Maybe not to me," he said. "But you might want to think about explaining it to her parents. Or your superiors. Or the people watching." The officer glanced around, noticing for the first time that several neighbors had stepped out of their homes. Phones were in hands, cameras pointed in his direction. The crowd was growing, and the murmurs were growing louder. Maya felt the tide beginning to turn, the power shifting away from the officer. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. The officer's expression darkened as the crowd grew larger, their quiet presence adding to the pressure. He scanned the faces watching him, his fingers twitching near his belt as if debating his next move. Dwayne Johnson remained steady, his broad frame an immovable wall between Maya and the officer. The way he stood calm, unshaken made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. "You might want to think about walking away," Dwayne said evenly, his voice carrying just enough force to command attention. The officer let out a sharp laugh, though it was clear he wasn't as confident as before. "You think you can just show up and tell me how to do my job?" he sneered. "This girl fits the description of someone we're looking for." Dwayne raised an eyebrow. "The description?" "Let me guess, young, black, walking home from school." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but his eyes burned with intensity. Maya, standing just behind him, felt her throat tighten. The anger and frustration she'd kept buried began to rise to the surface. For years, she'd been taught to stay quiet, to keep her head down, but watching Dwayne confront the officer sparked something inside her. "Why don't you just admit it?" Dwayne continued, his voice growing louder. "You saw a kid walking home and decided she didn't belong here. That's not policing, that's profiling." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, and the officer's face turned a deeper shade of red. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice cut through the tension. "Is everything okay here?" The crowd turned to see a middle-aged black woman stepping forward, her face a mix of concern and determination. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that demanded respect, and Maya instantly recognized her. Mrs. Hill, one of the few black homeowners in the neighborhood. "I couldn't help but notice the commotion," Mrs. Hill said, her gaze shifting between the officer and Dwayne. "What's going on?" The officer straightened, trying to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," he said, his tone dismissive. Mrs. Hill's eyebrows shot up. "It most certainly does. That young lady lives in this neighborhood, and I'll be damned if I'm going to stand by while you harass her." The crowd stirred, emboldened by her words. A few people nodded in agreement, and the quiet murmurs grew louder. The officer glanced around, clearly realizing he was losing whatever authority he thought he had. Maya looked at Mrs. Hill, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel alone. The officer took a step back, raising his hand slightly as if to signal he wasn't looking for trouble. "I'm just doing my job," he said defensively. "No," Mrs. Hill shot back, her voice sharp. "Your job is to protect and serve. Not to intimidate and profile." The crowd erupted into quiet applause, and the officer's face twisted in frustration. His hand hovered over his radio again, but he hesitated. He seemed to realize that calling for backup would only draw more attention to the situation and not in a way that worked in his favor. Dwayne took a step forward, his voice dropping to a calm but commanding tone. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to get in your car and leave. And the next time you think about stopping someone just because they don't look like they belong, you're going to think twice. Got it?" The officer glared at him, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched in his cheek. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but the growing pressure from the crowd and the unwavering presence of Dwayne left him no choice. Without a word, he turned and walked back to his patrol car. The door slammed shut, and the engine roared to life. The crowd parted as he pulled away, watching silently until the car disappeared around the corner. As the tension finally began to dissolve, a wave of relief washed over Maya. Her legs felt weak, and she realized she'd been holding her breath. "You okay, kid?" Dwayne asked, turning to her with a soft smile. Maya nodded, though her voice wavered when she spoke. I think so. Thank you." Mrs. Hill stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on Maya's shoulder. "You've got nothing to thank us for," she said gently. "You deserve to feel safe in your own neighborhood." The crowd began to disperse, but not before several people approached Dwayne and Mrs. Hill, expressing their gratitude for stepping in. Maya's mind was still racing as she looked at Dwayne. "Why did you? I mean, you didn't have to do that," she said. Dwayne chuckled softly. "Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't come with an invitation," he said. "And besides, I couldn't just stand by and let that happen." Maya nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone truly saw her not as a problem, but as a person. The officer's tone cut through the humid afternoon air like a blade, growing sharper with each question. His words were loud and accusing, and each one made Maya's chest tighten further. "Where'd you steal that phone?" he barked, nodding toward the device in her hand. Maya's grip tightened around her phone instinctively. Her voice trembled as she replied, "It's mine. My mom got it for me." The officer scoffed. "Oh, really? Got a receipt for that?" Maya's pulse quickened, her thoughts racing. Why was this happening? She'd done nothing wrong, just walked home like she always did. "What are you hiding in that bag?" he demanded next, his eyes narrowing. Maya looked down at her backpack, confusion and fear swirling inside her. "Books," she said, barely above a whisper. "Homework. That's all." The officer's hand hovered near his radio. "Sounds like you've got an answer for everything. Let's see what's in there," he said, reaching out as if he had the right to take it. Maya recoiled slightly, her voice firmer this time. "I didn't do anything wrong. You can't just." "I can and I will," he snapped, cutting her off. His tone was filled with disdain, and his gaze was as unrelenting as a predator's. A small crowd had begun to form, drawn by the commotion. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, and a few brave onlookers stepped onto their porches or sidewalks. Phones were raised, cameras capturing the unfolding scene. "Hey, is everything okay here?" someone called from the crowd. The officer barely glanced at them. "Stay back," he barked. "Police matter." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a mixture of concern and outrage. People exchanged glances, unsure of whether to intervene or wait to see what would happen. Maya felt the weight of their stares, her cheeks flushing with humiliation and anger. She had never felt so exposed, so helpless. Meanwhile, a sleek black SUV cruised down the street, its tinted windows glinting in the sunlight. The vehicle slowed to a stop a short distance from the scene, its engine purring softly. Inside, Dwayne Johnson gripped the steering wheel, his sharp eyes taking in the scene from behind the tinted glass. He'd been driving through the quiet neighborhood, enjoying a rare day off during his visit to town. But the moment he saw the officer's aggressive posture and the fear in Maya's eyes, his stomach churned. He knew that look all too well, the tension, the imbalance of power, the silent plea for help. It was a scene he'd read about too many times, a story he'd seen play out on the news over and over again. Not today, he muttered under his breath. Without hesitation, he shifted the SUV into park and opened the door. His boots hit the pavement with a heavy thud as he stepped out, his broad frame instantly commanding attention. The crowd stirred, a ripple of recognition passing through them. "Is that," someone whispered. "Dwayne Johnson," another voice murmured, barely above the sound of the gathering tension. The officer's back was to Dwayne, so he didn't notice the newcomer right away. But Maya did. Her wide eyes darted to him, a flicker of confusion and hope crossing her face. Dwayne adjusted his jacket as he approached, his steps purposeful but calm. He didn't rush, didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to shift the energy in the air. "Excuse me," Dwayne said, his deep voice cutting through the officer's tirade like a thunderclap. The officer spun around, his scowl deepening as he sized up the man who had interrupted him. His brows furrowed in vague recognition, but he didn't fully process who he was looking at. "This doesn't concern you," the officer said curtly, turning back to Maya. "Actually," Dwayne said, stepping closer, "it does." The officer stopped, glancing back at Dwayne with irritation. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but—" "You don't," Dwayne interrupted, raising an eyebrow. There was a murmur of suppressed laughter from the crowd. The officer's eyes flicked to the bystanders, then back to Dwayne, realization dawning on his face. Dwayne crossed his arms, his expression calm but unyielding. "I think you owe this young lady an explanation," he said, his voice steady. The officer straightened his posture, trying to reassert his authority. "She's acting suspicious." "I'm just doing my job." "Suspicious?" Dwayne repeated, his tone incredulous. "For walking home from school." "She's refusing to cooperate," the officer said defensively. "Looks to me like she's just trying to mind her business," Dwayne countered. He turned to Maya, his voice softening. "You okay?" Maya nodded slowly, though her eyes were still wide with fear and confusion. I think so," she whispered. The officer's jaw tightened. "I don't need a lecture from you," he snapped, his face red with frustration. Dwayne took a step closer, his imposing frame towering over the officer. "You might want to think carefully about your next move," he said, his tone dropping into a low, deliberate warning. The crowd began murmuring again, some people pulling out their phones to capture the interaction. The officer noticed this and seemed to falter for a moment, his eyes darting to the cameras. "Look," he said, his voice less certain now. "I'm just following protocol." "Protocol?" Dwayne repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Does protocol include harassing a teenager for no reason?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He seemed to be weighing his options, realizing that the tide of public opinion was quickly turning against him. At that moment, another figure stepped out of the crowd, a middle-aged black man in a crisp suit, carrying an air of authority. "I think it's time we de-escalated the situation," the man said firmly. The officer turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you?" The man pulled out a small badge, flashing it briefly. "Chief Walter Daniels." I oversee this precinct, he said, his voice calm but commanding. And I believe we need to have a conversation about appropriate conduct. The officer's face turned a shade paler as the reality of his situation sank in. The officer froze as Chief Daniels's words hung in the air. The badge gleamed in the sunlight, a stark reminder of the authority standing before him. His demeanor shifted slightly, the arrogance retreating under the weight of scrutiny. Chief Daniels, the officer stammered, his tone suddenly more measured, I was just responding to a potential situation. Daniels raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. A situation, he repeated slowly. He glanced at Maya, her backpack clutched tightly against her chest, her hands trembling slightly. This young woman doesn't look like a situation to me. Care to explain what warranted your actions? The officer's mouth opened and closed, struggling to find the right words. The crowd was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the exchange. She refused to comply, the officer muttered. Comply with what? Daniels asked, his tone sharp but calm. The officer hesitated. He glanced at the crowd, the phone still raised, and then at Dwayne, who stood like an unmovable mountain. Finally, he looked back at the chief, visibly shrinking under his gaze. She was walking with an attitude, he said weakly. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Daniels's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He turned to Maya, his voice softening. Young lady, would you mind telling me what happened? Maya hesitated, glancing at Dwayne. His reassuring nod gave her the courage to speak. I was just walking home, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He stopped me, started asking where I got my phone, what's in my bag. I didn't do anything. Daniels nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. Thank you for sharing that. He turned back to the officer, his expression hardening. Is there anything else? Or were you basing your entire response on your assumptions? The officer shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing against his radio. I thought she matched a description. And what description is that? Daniels pressed, his voice low and dangerous. The officer hesitated again, the silence stretching uncomfortably. It was clear to everyone watching that he had no real justification. Daniels took a step closer, his presence overwhelming despite his measured tone. Do you know what you've done here? You've not only failed to uphold the dignity of your badge, but you've also jeopardized the trust of this community. That's unacceptable. The crowd murmured in agreement, a low but growing tide of support for Daniels's words. Dwayne stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. This isn't just about one incident, he said, addressing the officer. This is about a pattern that people like you perpetuate when you act without thinking. You didn't see a teenager walking home. You saw a target. Maya's heart raced as she listened. Every word felt like a lifeline, pulling her out of the fog of fear and confusion. The officer's face was a mask of frustration and humiliation. He looked like he wanted to argue, but the weight of the crowd, the cameras, and Daniels's presence left him speechless. Daniels straightened, his voice ringing with authority. I'll be reviewing this incident personally. For now, I suggest you step away and leave this young woman alone. The officer hesitated for a moment longer, his pride warring with his common sense. Finally, he stepped back, muttering under his breath as he turned and walked toward his patrol car. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a wave of relief that swept through the crowd. Daniels turned to Maya, his expression softening. Are you all right? He asked gently. Maya nodded, though her voice was still shaky. Thank you, she said. Daniels nodded in return. You have nothing to thank me for. What happened here was wrong, plain and simple. And I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Dwayne stepped closer, his large hand resting lightly on Maya's shoulder. You did great, he said with a small smile. It's not easy standing your ground in a moment like that. Maya looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. I didn't feel brave, she admitted. Bravery isn't about not being scared, Dwayne replied. It's about doing what you have to do, even when you are scared. And you did that. The crowd began to disperse, people murmuring words of support and encouragement as they passed Maya and Dwayne. A few even approached Daniels, thanking him for stepping in. As the scene quieted, Mrs. Hill appeared once again, her expression a mix of pride and concern. She wrapped an arm around Maya's shoulders. You handled yourself better than most adults would have, she said warmly. Maya managed a small smile, though her legs still felt weak. I didn't know what to do, she admitted. You did everything right, Mrs. Hill assured her. And now you've got a whole community standing behind you. Dwayne glanced at Daniels, then back at Maya. You're not alone in this, he said. Not today, not tomorrow. Maya nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed it. The officer's hand hovered near his cuffs, his face a storm of frustration and embarrassment. He could feel the weight of the crowd's stares, the silent judgment amplified by the faint sound of phones recording. Still, he was determined to assert his authority, even if it meant escalating the situation further. Turn around, he barked at Maya, his voice sharper than ever. Maya froze, her breath hitching as panic set in. She clenched her fists, her thoughts racing. She hadn't done anything wrong. Why was this happening? She could barely hear the murmurs of the crowd over the pounding of her heart. The officer reached out, his fingers grazing her arm as he prepared to lock the cold metal cuffs around her wrist. But just before he could, a voice boomed, cutting through the tense air like a thunderclap. That's enough. The crowd instinctively parted, a collective gasp rising as Dwayne Johnson stepped forward, his towering frame exuding a quiet but unshakable authority. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination that made the officer freeze mid-motion. The officer turned, his scowl deepening as he realized who had spoken. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but his pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. This doesn't concern you, the officer snapped, though his voice lacked the conviction it had moments before. It does now, Dwayne said, his voice steady and commanding. He moved closer, each step deliberate and heavy, as if the earth itself acknowledged his presence. Maya's wide eyes darted to Dwayne, her fear giving way to a flicker of hope. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a ripple of excitement and relief spreading among the onlookers. Dwayne stopped just a few feet from the officer, his massive frame towering over him. He crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. This girl's done nothing wrong, he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The officer faltered, his hand dropping away from Maya's arm. She's being uncooperative, he muttered, though his tone was defensive now. Uncooperative. Dwayne repeated, his eyebrows raising. He gestured to Maya, who stood trembling but defiant. She's a kid, walking home from school. And you're treating her like she's a criminal. You think that's okay? The officer stammered, struggling to come up with a response. She matched a description, he said weakly. Dwayne's gaze hardened. What description? Brown skin and walking down the street. His words cut through the officer's excuses like a blade, each syllable deliberate and sharp. The crowd erupted in murmurs, their indignation growing. People shook their heads, some shouting words of agreement, others raising their phones higher to capture every moment. The officer's face turned a deep shade of red. He glanced at the crowd, then at Dwayne, clearly realizing he was outmatched. Still, his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. I'm just doing my job, he said, though his voice was unsteady. No, Dwayne countered, taking another step forward, his presence now filling the space between the officer and Maya. Your job is to protect and serve. Not to harass innocent kids because of your assumptions. The officer opened his mouth to argue, but Dwayne wasn't done. You think nobody's watching? That you can get away with this? Look around. He gestured to the crowd, their phones recording every word. You're not just answering to me. You're answering to all of them. To this community. And right now, you're failing. The officer's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him. He looked at Maya, then at Dwayne, and finally at the ground, as if searching for a way out. You're going to let her go, Dwayne said, his voice calm but unyielding. Now. For a moment, the officer hesitated, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with his pride. But the weight of the situation was too much. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped back. Maya exhaled shakily, relief washing over her like a wave. The crowd erupted into applause, cheers mixing with calls for accountability. Dwayne turned to Maya, his expression softening. You okay? He asked gently. Maya nodded, though her voice caught in her throat. I think so, she managed, her eyes brimming with tears. You were brave, Dwayne said, his tone reassuring. Don't forget that. Before Maya could respond, Chief Daniels stepped forward, his face a mix of disappointment and determination. He had been watching from the edge of the crowd, assessing the situation carefully. Now, it was his turn to act. Officer, Daniels said sharply, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. The officer turned, his face paling as he recognized the chief. Sir, he said quickly, straightening his posture. Daniels didn't waste time with pleasantries. You've not only failed to handle this situation appropriately, but you've also brought unnecessary shame to this department. I'll be expecting your report on my desk first thing tomorrow, and you'd better pray it includes an apology to this young lady. The officer stammered something unintelligible before retreating toward his patrol car, the humiliation evident in his every step. The crowd cheered again, their voices a mix of relief and triumph. Daniels turned to Maya, his expression softening. Are you all right? He asked. Maya nodded, her voice steadier now. Yes. Thank you. Daniels gave her a small nod before turning to Dwayne. Thank you for stepping in, he said. I appreciate it. Dwayne shook his head. It wasn't a choice, he said simply. It was the right thing to do. The crowd began to disperse, the tension giving way to a sense of community and solidarity. People approached Maya, offering words of encouragement and support. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Dwayne crouched down slightly so he was at eye level with Maya. Listen, he said, his tone serious but kind. What happened today? That's on him, not you. Don't let it make you doubt yourself or your place in this world. You're stronger than you think. Maya nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. Thank you, she said again, her voice filled with gratitude. Dwayne smiled back, patting her shoulder gently. Anytime, he said. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but not entirely. Some stayed behind, murmuring quietly about what they had just witnessed, while others approached Maya with words of encouragement. The weight of the moment hadn't lifted entirely, but the storm of fear and injustice was beginning to clear, leaving a bittersweet calm in its wake. Maya stood in the middle of it all, her heart still racing. She couldn't shake the memory of the officer's cold eyes and his voice laced with authority that felt more like a weapon. It was the first time she had ever felt so powerless, and yet, in the end, she wasn't. Dwayne stayed by her side, his imposing figure acting as a barrier between her and the lingering eyes of the crowd. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze again, his tone gentle but firm. You did nothing wrong, Maya, he said, his voice steady like an anchor. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Maya blinked back tears, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. I was so scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's normal," Dwayne replied, his eyes filled with empathy. "Fear doesn't mean you're weak. It means you care about what's at stake. And the way you stood your ground? That's strength." Maya nodded, though the weight of the encounter still lingered heavily on her shoulders. Chief Daniels approached them, his expression a mix of professional composure and genuine concern. "Miss Brown," he began, his tone softer than it had been with the officer. "I owe you an apology. What happened today shouldn't have happened. And I'm going to make sure it's addressed properly." Maya looked at him, her emotions a whirlwind of gratitude and lingering mistrust. "Do people ever really pay for things like this?" she asked, her voice trembling but bold. Daniels paused, taking a moment to choose his words carefully. "Sometimes, it feels like they don't," he admitted. "But that's why people like you, and people like him," he gestured to Dwayne, "are so important. Because when you stand up, it forces people like me to take notice and act." Maya absorbed his words, unsure if they truly comforted her. But she appreciated the effort, and something in his tone felt genuine. Daniels turned to Dwayne, extending his hand. "Thank you for stepping in. You didn't have to, but you did. And it made all the difference." Dwayne shook his hand firmly. "We all have to look out for each other," he said simply. "That's how it should be." Nearby, Mrs. Hill stood watching, her arms crossed over her chest, her face a mixture of pride and indignation. She had been a quiet force throughout the ordeal, but now she stepped forward, her voice carrying a strength that demanded attention. "Chief Daniels," she said, her tone polite but firm. "This isn't the first time we've seen something like this happen in our community. And I'm tired of hearing promises without seeing results. What's going to be different this time?" Daniels faced her, his posture respectful. "You're absolutely right, ma'am," he said. "And I don't expect words alone to fix this. That's why I'll be holding a community forum next week to hear directly from people like you, people who've been affected, who have ideas for change. And I'll make sure my officers are part of that conversation, too." Mrs. Hill narrowed her eyes slightly, clearly skeptical. "We'll hold you to that," she said. "You should," Daniels replied. The exchange seemed to ease some of the tension lingering in the crowd, though the skepticism in many faces remained. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a step. Dwayne turned to Maya again, his expression softening. "You've got people who care about you," he said, nodding toward Mrs. Hill and the few remaining neighbors who had stayed by her side. "Lean on them. And don't be afraid to speak up, even when it's hard." Maya nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking through. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier now. Dwayne smiled back, the corners of his eyes crinkling warmly. "You've got this," he said. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, the tension that had gripped the scene began to fade. The officer's patrol car had disappeared, and the crowd had dwindled to a few determined stragglers still discussing what had unfolded. Maya turned to Mrs. Hill, who immediately pulled her into a tight hug. "You did good, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "I didn't feel brave," Maya admitted, her voice muffled against Mrs. Hill's shoulder. "Bravery isn't about feeling brave," Mrs. Hill replied, pulling back to look at her. "It's about doing what's right, even when you're scared. And you did that today." Maya's smile grew a little wider, the weight on her chest lifting just enough to let her breathe deeply again. Dwayne watched the interaction from a few steps away, his arms crossed as he took in the scene. His work here was done, but he knew the fight for justice wasn't over, not for Maya, not for anyone. As he walked back to his SUV, he paused to look at Maya one last time. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying across the quieting street, "you're stronger than you think. And you're never alone in this." Maya nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and newfound confidence. As Dwayne drove away, the street fell into a reflective silence. The day had been a whirlwind, but for Maya, it marked the beginning of something new. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let fear define her. And neither would the community that had witnessed her strength today. Maya stood frozen in the middle of the street, her body still trembling from everything that had just happened. The world around her felt like it was moving in slow motion. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, and the events of the past hour replayed over and over in her mind. She felt a warm, reassuring weight on her shoulder, and when she looked up, she found Dwayne Johnson standing beside her, his gentle expression offering a quiet comfort amidst the storm. He crouched down slightly, his towering figure still imposing but softened by his sincere gaze. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and caring, the words carrying a depth of understanding. Maya didn't know how to answer. She couldn't find the words. Everything felt like a blur, a rush of emotions that left her feeling both exhausted and empowered. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally spilled over, her cheeks wet with a mix of relief and lingering fear. She nodded slowly, her voice caught in her throat. I think so," she whispered, her voice trembling as the weight of the moment sank in. Dwayne gave her a small, reassuring smile, his eyes full of empathy. "You did great, Maya. You stood up when it mattered most." The world was still reeling from the incident. Within hours, the videos from the altercation had gone viral. The footage of Maya's unjust treatment, the officer's aggressive stance, and Dwayne's intervention spread like wildfire across social media. It wasn't long before news outlets picked up the story, and the hashtag Justice for Maya began trending. People everywhere were talking about what had happened. The outrage was palpable, the call for accountability echoing from every corner of the city. And as the story gained more traction, Maya's name became known, not just in her community, but across the nation. The officer, whose actions had sparked the controversy, was swiftly placed on suspension pending an investigation. The department issued a public statement, though many saw it as too little, too late. Maya knew it was just the beginning, but it felt like a small victory. The system had finally been forced to acknowledge the wrong that had been done to her. But even as justice started to unfold, Maya felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: things would never be the same again. In the midst of the chaos, Maya found herself receiving an overwhelming amount of support from people who had been moved by her story. Strangers reached out to her, sending messages of encouragement and solidarity. Her friends rallied behind her, their support unwavering. Mrs. Hill checked in on her daily, offering words of comfort and guidance, making sure Maya knew she wasn't alone. Yet, amidst all of this, Maya found herself returning to one person who had made all the difference that day: Dwayne Johnson. He had been more than just a hero in that moment. He had been a steady presence, someone who saw her for who she truly was, someone who recognized the strength within her, even when she couldn't see it herself. Dwayne had stayed in touch with Maya after the incident. It started with a simple text message, just checking in. "How are you doing today?" From there, their conversations became a regular thing. Dwayne offered Maya advice, encouragement, and most importantly, he reminded her of her worth. He never let her forget the strength she had shown, even when the world seemed to be against her. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small, Maya," he would tell her over the phone. "You have a voice. And it's powerful." Maya found herself leaning on his words more and more as the days passed. With each conversation, she grew more confident, more certain of who she was and what she could accomplish. He helped her understand that the injustice she had experienced wasn't her fault. It was a reflection of the world's broken systems, systems that could be changed, but only if people were willing to fight for it. In a particularly heartfelt conversation one evening, Dwayne told Maya something that stayed with her. "You've got something in you that a lot of people don't have," he said, his voice sincere. "You've got a fire. Don't let anyone put it out." That was all Maya needed to hear. The fire had always been there, but it had been hidden under layers of fear and doubt. Dwayne had helped her find it again. Meanwhile, the investigation into the officer's conduct moved forward, and the department's response was swift. A public review of the incident was scheduled, and members of the community were invited to attend. Maya, though nervous, knew that this was another step in the journey toward justice. She had been through the hardest part, the fear, the uncertainty, the pain, but now, with Dwayne's support and the community behind her, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The officer, who had tried to make her feel guilty, who had tried to intimidate her into submission, was now the one facing scrutiny. The community rallied around Maya, their voices unified in their demand for accountability. They held signs, marched together, and called for justice, not just for Maya, but for anyone who had ever been unfairly treated. As the weeks passed, the officer's case came to a head. The investigation revealed a history of misconduct, a pattern of bias and excessive force that had been overlooked for far too long. It wasn't just Maya who had suffered at his hands, others had been victims of his actions, too. In the end, the officer was terminated from the force. His actions had finally caught up with him, and Maya, along with the countless others who had supported her, felt a sense of justice being served. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the trauma or the hurt that had been caused. But it was a start. As Maya sat with her family, reflecting on everything that had happened, she couldn't help but think about the journey she had been on. She had never imagined that her ordinary walk home from school would lead to something so extraordinary. But in a way, it had changed her forever. She had learned that standing up for herself wasn't just about facing down a bully, it was about finding the strength to speak up, even when the odds felt impossible. She had learned that her voice mattered. And she had learned that justice, while not always quick, was worth fighting for. Dwayne, as promised, continued to check in with Maya, guiding her through the process of understanding her own strength and potential. "You've got a lot to offer, Maya," he reminded her. "Don't let anyone tell you differently." Maya was beginning to believe that. She was no longer the scared girl walking home from school. She was someone who had stood up for herself, and in doing so, had sparked a movement that rippled far beyond that street corner. The justice she had fought for wasn't just hers, it was for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or oppressed. It was a victory not just for her, but for every person who had ever dared to stand up, even when it seemed like the world was against them. And as for Dwayne, he continued to stay by Maya's side, mentoring her in quiet ways that made all the difference. His actions had made a real impact, but it was his words, his belief in her, that would stay with Maya forever. "You've got this," he would say. And every time he did, Maya believed it a little more. The days that followed Maya's encounter with the officer were filled with a mix of emotions. There were moments when she could still hear the harshness in the officer's voice, feel the tight grip of fear that had held her frozen. But there were other moments that reminded her of everything she had learned, everything she had become in the process. At first, the weight of it all felt heavy, almost too much to carry. The flashbacks, the fear, and the pressure of knowing that her name was now tied to something so much bigger than she had ever anticipated. But as time went on, the heaviness began to lift. It was replaced by something else, something brighter, something stronger. Maya began to see her journey in a different light. It wasn't just about that one moment on the street, standing face to face with a man who had tried to intimidate her. It was about everything that had led up to it, the quiet moments of courage she had shown even when she thought no one was watching. The strength she had discovered within herself, step by step, even when she felt small or insignificant. She realized now that her courage hadn't started when Dwayne stepped in, it had started long before that. It had started in the quiet moments when she had chosen not to back down, when she had stood tall in the face of unfairness and kept moving forward, even when things seemed impossible. And as the weeks went by, Maya began to see the power of her voice. It wasn't just about speaking up for herself anymore, it was about speaking up for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or oppressed. Her story had inspired people. It had brought attention to an injustice that had been ignored for too long, and now, it was sparking a conversation about change. Sometimes, Maya thought back to that day when she had stood there, vulnerable and unsure, with the officer's cold eyes on her. It seemed like such a small moment in the grand scheme of things. But it had changed everything. It had changed her. And it had changed the way others saw her. The world had a way of making people feel small. It told them to be quiet, to keep their heads down, to blend in. But Maya had learned something different. She had learned that sometimes, the loudest act of courage didn't come from shouting or fighting back, it came from speaking up when it mattered most. It came from standing firm in the face of injustice, even when it felt like no one was listening. As Maya walked through the halls of her high school, the weight of her experience carried a new lightness. People who had once ignored her now smiled and greeted her. Teachers who had once overlooked her achievements now recognized her potential. The once quiet girl who had always been afraid of speaking out had found her voice, and now, it wasn't just a voice, it was a force. But it wasn't just about the recognition, or the support that had come her way. Maya had learned that standing up for what's right is never easy. It takes bravery, it takes patience, and it takes knowing that even in the toughest moments, there is always a path forward. Sometimes, that path was filled with obstacles, and sometimes, it seemed like the fight would never end. But she had learned to walk that path anyway, with the belief that one voice, even a quiet one, could make a difference. Maya hadn't just walked away from that day stronger, she had carried something with her, something deep within her heart. It was a belief, one that she held onto tightly, that even in the darkest moments, there was always someone willing to stand by your side. She had seen it that day, in the form of Dwayne Johnson. His intervention had been a turning point, but it wasn't just his physical presence that had mattered, it was his belief in her, his trust in her strength, that had helped her find her courage. She thought of how many people there were in the world who felt like they didn't have anyone standing with them. How many people, every day, felt like their voice didn't matter. How many had been silenced, ignored, or made to feel small. Maya knew now that those were the people who needed to find their courage, too. She had found hers, and in doing so, she had inspired others to find theirs. And as she looked forward to the future, Maya knew that her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The fire she had uncovered inside her was still burning, still growing. She had learned that the fight for justice was never truly over, it was a continuous journey, and it was up to her to keep walking that path. But now, she walked with her head held high. She walked with the knowledge that she could face whatever came her way, because she was no longer alone. There were others like her, others who were ready to stand up, to speak out, to change the world together. Sometimes, Maya thought to herself, you have to stand tall, even when you're afraid. Because it's in those moments, when you choose courage over fear, that you truly change the world. Maya's story was more than just a moment of bravery on a street corner. It was a story of growth, of finding strength in the face of adversity, of learning that the loudest act of courage often came from the quiet moments when you chose to stand up for what was right. She had learned that courage wasn't just about fighting back against injustice, it was about believing in yourself, no matter how small you felt, and knowing that your voice had power. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest lesson of all. Maya smiled to herself as she walked down the street, her heart light with a newfound purpose. She had stepped into the light that day, and now, there was no turning back. She was no longer the girl who had been afraid to speak up. She was the girl who had found her voice, and in doing so, had found her strength. In the end, Maya knew that the world would try to push you down, try to make you feel small. But if you could find the courage to rise above it, if you could find the strength to speak up when it mattered most, then nothing could ever keep you down. And that was the true power of courage, the power to stand firm, no matter what. And Maya, with her courage, was only just beginning to show the world what it meant to stand tall.